So this week on Team 33, we're heading to South America, and who better to do that with than Tim Vickery. Tim, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Let's kick the ball around.
So last week, something that we weren't used to over the last couple of years, we saw a Copa Libertadores final on TV at a time that we were awake enough to actually capture what was going on. Palmeiras won 1-0 against Santos. In general, decent enough game, but not really what European standards would expect when you're thinking about the best South American clubs.
No, well, there is a chasm these days between the best club football in Europe and the best club football in South America. But Saturday's game was ruined, I think, because of the kickoff time, which was 5 o'clock in the afternoon, our time. The game's originally scheduled for late November, which is spring, and because of the pandemic, the calendar has changed it to the end of January, 30th of January, which is high summer. Christ, it was hot out there. Really, really hot. But the kickoff time was maintained. That's because I'm reliably informed by the broadcasters. That's because of Brazilian free-to-air TV. That's right. Not because of European TV. The broadcasters selling it to Europe would have been quite happy to move it back 2 hours. But Brazilian free TV insisted. And so, extreme heat produces cautious games, especially when you've got a cautious side like Palmeiras, who, they'll wait. They'll wait for their moment. They've got a much deeper. They're much wealthier than Santos. A much deeper squad. Many more options on the bench. So Palmeiras, their approach was, if it goes to extra time, it goes to extra time. We've got the options. The longer it goes on, the more chance that our moment will appear, and it did. Thankfully, the players weren't forced through extra time. It ended up it was a 10th minute stoppage time, I think, that the only goal went in. And the fellow who scored it, or Breno Lopes, a couple of months ago, he was playing in Brazil's second division. He's signed too late to play in the Club World Cup, which is just about to get underway in the Middle East. And he wouldn't have, I don't think he'd have got on had the much highly rated teenager, Gabriel Veron, been fit, because Veron would have been first option on the bench and Breno Lopes would have been sitting there kicking his heels. So we had an unlikely hero and some late drama, but not really enough, I think, to compensate for a very disappointing game caused in large measure by extreme conditions.
In terms of the club scene in South America at the minute, I suppose everyone would know Santos because that's where Neymar came from. That's where Pele played a lot of his football. Boca Juniors beaten in the semi-final. Palmeiras, I think people would know them, or at least know their crest, at least from video games or wherever. What, in terms of the powerhouses in South America at the minute in the club scene, who would be the standout team at the minute?
Well, we're beginning to see more continuity. We're beginning to see the same few teams at the business end of the Libertadores every year, and that didn't used to happen. Financial gaps are opening up, and also Europe is no longer interested in the most important players here. It's interested in the young talent. It's interested in the 18, 19-year-olds, not interested in the 24, 25-year-olds. So that's another reason I think that we're having more continuity. So in Brazil at the moment, they are Palmeiras and Flamengo. In Argentina, they are Boca Juniors and River Plate. Grêmio of Brazil have been punching above their weight. They nearly made it to a fourth consecutive semi-final, which would have been a fantastic achievement. We're seeing those clubs year after year after year, business end of the Libertadores. Financial fortunes can fluctuate. Others can break into that little set, especially from Brazil. And if Corinthians were to sort their finances out, they could break in. One of the teams from Belo Horizonte, perhaps in Brazil. But it's been very since we've switched in 2017. We switched from a format where the Libertadores was crammed into the first 6 months of the year to an all-year format. And the longer the format, the more the money clubs are benefited because they have time to reinforce their squad and so on. So since that change, we've seen an almost total domination of Brazil and Argentina. The last final in the old format, when it was squeezed into the first few months of the year, was Atlético Nacional of Colombia against Independiente del Valle of Ecuador. Since then, from 2017 on, it's been almost total domination from Brazil and Argentina.
Right. And would it be similar enough to what's happening in Europe at the minute with the likes of Real Madrid, PSG, Barcelona, Man United getting together, almost the super clubs dominating and almost working together so that they do continue to stay at the top?
Yeah, it's this has happened much more recently in South America than in Europe, but we're beginning to see that same kind of domination of a group of clubs without the quality that you have at the very top level of Europe. There could be changes here because Mexican clubs were in the Libertadores until the format was changed, and they couldn't fit it into their calendar when the format was changed. In fact, they weren't consulted, which was a dreadful error, because Mexican clubs, it's a huge country, massive TV market. The Mexican clubs will be back. So okay. that's a game changer. And there's also the possibility, although the logistics here are really difficult, but there's the possibility in the near future of clubs in the United States entering, Major League Soccer clubs, which again that's a game changer. So I pity the players with the amount of travelling that they'll have to do, because that's really, really difficult. But you can see the obvious synergies. The football in the States has momentum, but it doesn't have credibility. Mm-hmm. Club football in South America is a little bit the opposite. So you put them both together. The South Americans get more money, the North Americans get more credibility. So the value of the synergies are obvious there, and I think it's going to happen. Although, as I say, I pity the players who are going to be spending hours and hours on aeroplanes.
Yeah, God, you'd nearly have to do that in one location as opposed to having it.
Well, that's been my idea. Why don't you retain the separate tournaments? One for the CONCACAF region, because the problem of the States and Mexico joining South America's competition is that you carve out all of the rest of CONCACAF. You carve out all of Central America and all of the Caribbean. So my idea would be, well, why not retain the Libertadores as a separate entity and the CONCACAF Champions League, and then have a tournament of, say, the top four from both in one location. But the more likely, I'm told, at the moment is a Libertadores, including Mexico and possibly the United States.
Well, it'll be definitely interesting, if nothing else, as well as really difficult for the players who already do a massive amount of traveling, because the difference between the Champions League flying from London to France is much different from flying from Brazil to Argentina or into Chile. So that'll be interesting to see how that develops. In terms of international football, one of the interesting things that's going on right now is the World Cup qualifiers for the South American sides, because we're still in European qualifiers for the Euros next year. It's supposed to be this year, but who knows what's going to happen. Yeah. In terms of the teams dominating Brazil, 4 wins from 4 under Tete, Argentina 3 wins, 1 draw under Lionel Scaloni. In terms of Brazil, let's start with them. I was looking at their squad, and on sheer talent alone, this seems to be one of the most exciting Brazil sides we've seen this decade, probably. Is that how it's panning out? What type of football are they playing at the minute?
Yeah, since Chichi took over in late 2016, they've been much better, much easier on the eye. They've never been quite as good as they were late 2016 and through 2017 in the qualifiers. When they went to 2018, when they went to the World Cup, a number of things didn't quite work. They weren't quite as good then, as perhaps they peaked a little bit too early. But I still think they could have won 2018. They were one of the 4 best sides there. And that game against Belgium was, for me, it was the game of the tournament. And over the balance of the 90 minutes, I certainly think Brazil deserved the chance to take it into extra time. So they weren't far off. Argentina in 2018 were predictably an absolute disaster and have bounced back better than anyone could have expected under a rank novice coach. They've done amazingly well, I think, considering how bad they were in 2018 and how inexperienced Scaloni is. They've done well. There are still problems there. You still can't see a top quality centre back and maybe a top quality goalkeeper. But they're looking more like a team. World Cup qualification in South America is really interesting. we don't have those kind of almost worthless games that you have in Europe. Since we've had this format, it's a revolution, really, in 1996, when we started this marathon format of all the 10 countries playing each other home and away. For the first time ever, it gave South American national teams the calendar that European national teams take for granted. Regular competitive games, guaranteed income. And so over the last few years, you've seen an interesting dynamic where the World Cup is dominated by Western Europe. At the top, Brazil and Argentina as not as dominant as they were, partly for their own reasons, but I think chiefly because of the rise of Western Europe. And who would have thought Brazil play Belgium? Belgium's a tiny little country. And who would have thought that the player most stereotypically Brazilian on the field would be Belgian? Eden Hazard. Europe is producing players of a type. Something interesting is happening there, and look at the English talent that's coming through, the Alexander Arnolds and all the rest of it. I saw Diego Latorre was a good player in his day, and now Argentina's best analyst, I think, saying, look, they're all like street football kids. They're exactly the type of players that 10 years ago we thought couldn't be produced through the academy system. So let's give credit to Western Europe in terms of some of the players that it's producing. At the highest level, Brazil and Argentina are struggling a little bit, although Argentina reached the final in 2014. But there's never been more strength in depth. Just look at the recent history. 2006 was the best World Cup in the history of Ecuador. 2010 was the best World Cup in the history of Paraguay. 2014 was the best World Cup in the history of Colombia. 10 and 14 were the best in the history of Chile, with the exception of 62, which they hosted. Uruguay have come right back to the top table in a manner that even Uruguay thought was impossible 15 years ago. So there's real strength in depth in the South American national teams, but at the very highest level, they're struggling to compete with Western Europe. Although I think Brazil weren't far off in 18. Mm-hmm. And I'll be very interested to see how both them and Argentina can roll in 2022.
Well, I think from my perspective anyway, one of the things I took from Brazil and Argentina was they always had these amazing squads, but absolutely no cohesion or organization within it. And it seems like Brazil are starting to get that a little bit. One thing that stands out from Brazil, though, is I was just looking at their squad for the World Cup qualifiers, and they've got in the forward line Roberto Firmino, Gabriel Jesus, Richarlison, Rodrigo, and Neymar. There's no real centre forward there that's a goal-scoring centre forward. And it was the same, was it the 2014 World Cup that they played Fred as a centre forward? Why isn't Brazil producing the Ronaldos anymore?
That's a really good question. And it's amazing that centre forward has become a problem position, but it really, really has. I wonder if it's because domestic Brazilian football has fallen way behind Europe, and now the defensive lines. There are attempts to change this, but the defensive lines play very, very deep. You saw with Palmeiras on Saturday. Now we're talking about the continental champions. Their centre forward, Luis Adriano, he's practically playing on a different landmass from the rest of the team. It's hard. It's hard to do that. The counterpoint here is there's lots of space on the field. So what type of player is Brazilian football producing in profundity? It's strikers in the wide spaces, because that's the kind of player who thrives on having that amount of acceleration space. So that I think is apart from just random arguments of coincidence. If you want to see why, I think that's the main reason, that the way that a lot of domestic Brazilian football is being played sacrifices a centre forward at the expense of these wide strikers. Who Brazil they have more wide strikers than they could possibly know what to do with.
And I suppose if you look at the biggest sides in the world right now. They're all playing like that as well. Like Liverpool play with Firmino as the false nine. PSG rely on. I mean, they got rid of their Uruguayan centre
Yeah.
forward in Cavani, and that seems to be the way that football is going. But
Yeah, although who's the club? Who's the club? Who's the champions of the Champions League?
Bayern Munich,
Yeah,
Lewandowski.
indeed. So if you have that type of player who's good enough, oh, he's useful.
Yeah, I suppose that's one of the interesting things about modern football is that when teams like Klopp's Liverpool or Pep's Barcelona come in and change it so much, and then eventually everyone plays that way. If you revert to the type from 10, 15 years ago, often that can be very effective against the new brand of football.
Yeah, and I remember Greece winning the Euros in 2004 with kind of man-to-man marking.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people have forgotten it. So Back to the Future.
Mm-hmm. In terms of Argentina, then again, a complete rookie coach that's taken over the side and an absolute shambles. I was again looking at the squad, and just in comparison to previous squads, it's not filled with the superstars that you are accustomed to seeing playing for Argentina. Like Angel Di Maria is no longer in it. Aguero is no longer in it.
He was in the squad last time around.
Oh,
Aguero's only not been in because of injury, but I suspect that he's had so many injuries now that I suspect his best is gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely seems that way. And then Messi is not getting any younger. So in terms of Scaloni's style of football, is it still get the ball to Messi, see what he can do, or is he spraying it out a little bit more?
It's been really interesting because Scaloni took over as a caretaker, but he was saying, no, we're going to play rapid transitions. That's what's working in world football, and that's what we want to do. And straight away you were thinking, Messi doesn't fit into this. He's not. That's just not going to happen. You can't play with like a centre forward, two open wingers, and Messi. You know, and do you really expect to do that? Now Messi took the first few games off, the first few months off, and then we had the Copa America in 19 in Brazil, and Argentina's first game against Colombia, they were an absolute shambles. Because of this, you had Messi housing an idea that just didn't suit him. They were all over the place, the space between the lines. And then gradually during the competition, you saw Scaloni start to work something out. He dropped Di Maria. That was harsh on Di Maria because it wasn't Di Maria's fault, but just the system just wasn't working for him to play as an open winger. He can do other things as well, but that's what he was doing. And so they got to something more compact, and they've kept getting better. Messi, I think, has been a really interesting part of this because you were wondering after 2018, is he going to want to bother? And he really has. For in that Copa America, because there was always a kind of discontent around the Argentina camp with, Messi doesn't talk. He only ever talks to his mate Aguero. He's in his own little world, and there were always these whispers. And in Brazil 2019, he wasn't like that at all. He'd obviously sat down and made a conscious effort and thought, well, I don't have that long left. What can I do? What can I work on? And he was such an encouraging figure. He was a much more sociable figure, and he really became the leader. And he was defending the team. He was talking and talking and talking after the games. In fact, he talked himself into trouble. It was a little bit like a kind of striker's tackle. You're not that used to it, and he ended up talking himself into trouble, accusing the competition of being corrupt. So Messi's on board, and that has helped, I think. The youngsters have flourished because so much of the responsibility is put on him, and that I think has allowed some of the youngsters to flourish. I still think that they have problems at centre back. And who is it? Otamendi. I thought back in 2008 was going to be the solution, but he's not quite there, and he tries to compensate. I think being the bully boy.
Yeah.
And Martinez Quarta, who's just joined Fiorentina, who is just not up to it. I think he's one of those with a centre of gravity in his neck. But that's a real problem. That the lack of good centre backs. It's hard to remember. And the last one for me, Ajala, and he went in 2007. Samuel Since then, they've really been struggling for centre backs, and I can't at the moment see a solution.
Yeah, it's a vast generalization that I'm about to make, but it seems that the Argentine centre backs always have that little bit of a nutcase in them that they can get sent off if at crucial moments, or they can dive into tackles and miss out on the ball, and that just seems to be something that they have in them. The Marcus Rojo is another example of someone who's quite like that. Without projecting the narrative onto Messi, because I do feel like it has become a narrative to this point where Messi will not be accepted in Argentina until he wins a World Cup like Maradona did. Do you think that he feels that? Is that a real thing, or is that just something that people assume?
Well, he'd love to win it. He's a winner, and he's only got one more crack. He's not going to be in the Argentine psyche what Maradona is. It would be impossible for him to do that. I mean, Maradona's life could hardly have been scripted better to be an Argentine idol. So I don't think Messi has any particular problems with that. He just he wants to win. So he's got one more crack at it, and even with their deficiencies, I think he will be thinking that his side have a much better chance in 22 than they did in 18, when they were just an absolute shambles.
Mm. It would be a brilliant end to his career, at least,
wouldn't it? Just
with Argentina to win the World Cup, because
just?
When he dragged them to the final, and he did drag them to the final a few years back, and they didn't win, you're just thinking that's it. It's never going to happen for him. So I personally would love to see the career of Messi crowned with a World Cup at the end of it. It would be a great way to end. Before we finish up then, Tim, one thing that I do want to talk about is a story that came up a few years ago, and it's not really something that's been covered that much, but Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, the far-right leader, there's an odd connection between him and the Brazilian football world, because when he was running, he got the endorsement of Ronaldinho, of Rivaldo, of Felipe Melo, and was publicly backed by the likes of Lucas Moura and Cafu as well. What's the link there? Why is he supported by these guys?
One bigger question you have to ask, I think, at the moment is, what's the left? What does the left mean in an era where trade unions have been absolutely emasculated to the point of almost irrelevance, and that means that it's, and I think you've seen this all over the world, it's very hard to construct an alternative narrative in society, a kind of solidarity-based left-wing narrative that used to be diffused through the trade union movement. That's gone, and that was never particularly strong in Brazil. But anyway, that kind of alternative narrative has gone. The Workers' Party, they won 4 consecutive presidential elections, and Lula was president twice, and then Dilma Rousseff was impeached during her second term. It was never really a left-wing government, and that was made open and apparent before the first election win, when Lula wrote an open letter to Brazil, and it was he was more or less saying, we're going to have to govern within the system, with financial capital, which obviously there's not a lot of revolutionary change you can make there. So if it couldn't really make fundamental economic change, and for a while everyone did well, everyone was winning because of the export boom, selling things to China, really. That was the reason. There was no great miracle in Brazil. It was like China was buying, and everyone was winning. And then the government was popular. As soon as China stopped growing at that extraordinary rate, and Brazil then caught a cold, you began to see the conflict. Now, if the left can't really move economically, or can make limited progress economically, where does it try to make progress? Where? And the answer, I think, is in social matters. A pro-feminist, I'm sorry about the terminology, LGBT, is that, I've been away to, so that's where they made some progress. These things aren't necessarily left-wing causes, really. I mean, all of this can be assimilated very well inside capitalism because you're creating new markets. But anyway, that's what they became associated with. And so you got this kind of cultural war type thing where a mate of mine, a journalist from Belgium who spends a lot of time in Brazil and knows lots of the big figures in football and spends too much time with them for his own good, I think. And he told me that it was one thing that all of them were saying to him, all of them. These days, if you want to get a degree in Brazil, you've got to be a drug-taking homosexual.
Wow.
And like so, that kind of social conservatism thing is very, very strong. We're seeing in Brazil where these movements, women's movements and LGBT and so on, they've made big progress. But that encounters a resistance. The Bolsonaro thing, a lot of them, and the ideological wing of the government, they are absolutely batshit crazy. Really, when the intellectual guru behind them suspects, he doesn't believe, he suspects that the songs of the Beatles were actually written by a German Marxist professor in order to bring down Western society. That's what they think.
Yeah.
But the way that this projects, Bolsonaro is like the uncle that you know from the family gathering, from the old days when the old hierarchies were in place and everyone knew their place. And one of the visions of Brazil that he likes to try and he'd like to recreate the 1950s. Now, the football in Brazil is a very right-wing world, and a lot of the players you mentioned have come from poor backgrounds, but they've never really been in any kind of left-wing involvement, in part because of the emasculation of the trade union movement, which is not particularly strong in Brazil anyway. So they haven't got that. And the trade unions, I mean, for people my age, I distantly remember them from the 70s as almost like a religion. So what do they have?
Yeah.
They have the real religion. And I've only just really discovered this in the past few years, because I don't come from a religious upbringing. You know, we kind of have the idea of religion as the ultimate good chap, you know, and you read the fucking texts. Gee, my God, you know, I mean, the law of Moses is basically a slave owner's charter.
Yeah.
And you know, there's things in there that if a woman or a young girl is married with a father, with the family saying she's a virgin, and it's discovered that she's not a virgin, then she should be stoned to death. You know, we've left a time bomb forgetting these things and allowing the Christians to just cherry pick. Oh yeah, that bit's nice and that bit's nice, because lots of it is really toxic and it's really, really socially conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And the evangelicals, they're growing up in an environment where the evangelical churches offer a kind of support structure for poor Brazilians. In return for that support structure, you're getting this shit at you all the time. I'll give you the case of Robinho. Now, Robinho has been convicted in 2 instances of rape in Italy. He's still innocent in the eyes of the law because he still has 1 instance to go. But he's been convicted 2 instances of rape. And he's taken refuge in evangelical Christianism. And he was saying, he said, unfortunately, there's this feminist movement these days. That's
Wow.
where quite a few of them are, you know.
Right.
When Bolsonaro came in, because you're not dealing with people who are particularly politically sophisticated anyway, because that kind of left-right debate. As I say, I go back to the absence of a kind of trade union movement, that kind of left-right debate. It's not really, so they don't really know what Bolsonaro is, but he comes across as an uncle from the 1950s. But also, the previous, the PT governments, they operated within the system.
Mm.
I understand why they made that choice, because a lot of their people, the people they want to help, are in very, very precarious circumstances. So what they don't want to do is play politics with people's lives. They don't want to provoke extra parliamentary chaos. They want to work within the system. But that puts limits. And the system in Brazil, the political system, works on corruption. That's the fuel in the tank. If you want to get things done, you've got to grease some palms. And they went into this buying off politicians from other parties in order to win support. But the problem with these schemes is, you enter into this scheme as a means to an end, and it pretty soon becomes an end in itself. So they got tarred with a corruption brush. They're corrupt, they're corrupt, they're corrupt. And Bolsonaro was able to present himself as anti-corruption. That has a big populist appeal. By now, the kind of anti-corruption wing of his right-wing coalition have broken off, because they've seen that it's not particularly relevant to him. But that's still that kind of 1950s style reassuring presence has an appeal to those of a socially conservative nature.
Yeah, and
sometimes the left is its own worst enemy, because it can shriek hysterically, hunt the deviant, hunt the deviant. You're instead of trying to develop people, instead of trying to allow people to learn, it can yell at them. And I remember seeing a really good thing about Trump. I can't remember who it was, but it was American. I don't usually agree with him, but he was saying, one of the great things about Trump is that you don't feel morally inferior to him. He doesn't make you feel morally inferior. He makes you feel that you're all right. And I think there's some of that in Bolsonaro as well. I hope that in the build up to the next elections, because the handling of the coronavirus thing here has been so inept, off the scale of ineptitude, I hope that that's the issue that will bring him down, as it did with Trump. But I am worried, because if you look at what happened with the Trump rioters, in the storming of the Capitol, put that in Brazil. Number one, the big lesson you learn is, if you're going to do that, you've got to go all out. You can't do it half cock. So that's lesson number one. Number two is, if that were to happen in Brazil, the likelihood, the very, very strong likelihood, is they would receive much more help from the police than was the case with Trump. So getting out of this situation is not going to be easy. I'm concerned for the future.
Right. That's really interesting, because I would have assumed naturally that it was economic, that the richer people support him for economic reasons as opposed to social reasons. But
there is that as well. It's a right-wing coalition, and there is that as well. Because it is a strange kind of populism from Bolsonaro, because there is no economic populism in there, which there was from Trump. Trump identifies the white working class, and according to the great Scottish political economist Mark Blyth, the bottom 30% actually did benefit a little bit from things that Trump did. There's none of that. He has offered nothing economically, with the exception of plans for more privatization and more precarious labor, which isn't in the interests of the poor. But the left have been unable to come up with an economic argument. The left have been, I think, in their response, have been very, very disappointing. And I hope we'll be able to do things better in 2022.
Before we finish up, Tim, is Ronaldinho still in jail, or is he out now?
No, he's out. He managed to get out. Just to finish this with the Bolsonaro thing. Edmilson played for Barcelona. He's an intelligent man. He's a Bolsonaro supporter, and Barcelona were obviously, with their anti-General Franco thing, were astonished at this. And he was on Catalan radio, and they said, "Why do you support Bolsonaro? He's a man of God."
That's completely the opposite to what I would have assumed looking in from Europe. But that's extremely interesting. Janino, I read, is on the left wing, the free kick specialist, which there was an interview with him on The Guardian a few months back, and he's still looking as handsome as he always did with the beard, and he's sort of matured, and he's on the left, so that makes him even cooler in my eyes, in fairness. Tim Vickery, it's been interesting and eye-opening as always. Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you.